India, Qatar, South Africa, Turkey, and back to London again. Thank you for joining us in our US session today. My name is Huda and I'll be hosting this evening. We have an exciting event planned this evening with our speaker, Imam Shoaib Webb, and Abdurrahman Malik joining us from New York, and our guest speaker, Chris Bulville, and Dara Tamr from Detroit. But before I get started, I'd like to thank our media partners for this year, Islam Channel, and give a special welcome to those joining us from Islam Channel's Facebook and YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you all with us today. I also wanted to thank Arts Council UK, whose help has allowed us to continue our work this Ramadan, all of which is available on our website. Our work this Ramadan is supported by Islamic Relief, our charity partner, and you can check the incredible work of Islamic Relief in iruk.co/RTP. So our event is interactive, so we'd like to encourage everybody to hop onto the Zoom meeting, and for those who feel comfortable, to turn on your camera. And finally, a bit of tech run. If you look at the bottom of your screen, or in the More section of your phone, you have a reaction option, so you can show us how you feel in real time. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask any questions or contribute to the discussion, and one of our back-end team will unmute you. And also you can post on the chat, and we'll be checking the chat. So let's begin. First of all, I'd just kind of like to get to know a bit more about your Ramadan and how it's going. So Iman, how's your Ramadan going? Like, what do you have? Both Dar, just tell us a bit more about your Ramadan so far.
Assalamu alaikum. Well, my Ramadan so far has been good. I'd like to say that this Ramadan was a lot easier than the last Ramadan. I think maybe it's just, getting used to Ramadan and lockdown. So yeah, I mean, it's been great so far. Blessing in disguise, to be honest. Got to spend more time with my brother, so normally I wouldn't have that opportunity. But yeah, alhamdulillah, Ramadan's been good. How about yourself?
It hasn't been too bad, alhamdulillah. I think it's kind of, I feel like, because it's not in the summer, it's not as long, but also because I'm in a Scandinavian country, kind of weighs that out. But I'm kind of getting the hang of it. So I think at like the last 10 days, you start to figure it out, and then it's always gone.
Yeah, that's the case every Ramadan, right? Like you start getting used to it and enjoying it, and then before you know it, it's almost the end of Ramadan.
Yeah, it's quite short.
Yeah, I guess also because now we're moving towards like shorter days. Like now that Ramadan's moving earlier and earlier, the days are shorter. So maybe that's why I'm finding it easier to fast. Because I remember a couple of years ago it was bang on in the summertime and it was the hardest.
I feel like lockdown life is a bit sedentary anyway, so you're kind of just sitting down more, so you don't have to struggle as much, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but then at the same time you're not really active, so it's kind of doing the opposite. So I feel like you have more weight in Ramadan. Suppose. Yeah, I don't know, it's weird, but alhamdulillah, I'm still loving this month. So
perfect. Daruk, how about you? How's your Ramadan going?
Alhamdulillah. I've been trying to juggle between work, kind of community programs, final season. Alhamdulillah. So I finished most of my finals yesterday, but I have a few more things to kind of wrap up by Tuesday. And so it's just the timing has been nice because it's aligning right with the last 10 nights of Ramadan approximately. So alhamdulillah, in all honesty, the first couple weeks were challenging because not being able to fully dedicate yourself to worship in the way that you might want to, but just like last year, subhanallah, I think we learned that lesson pretty tough, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to change up your circumstances, and that's the challenge, is how could you find the beauty in other forms of worship and in ways that you might not normally kind of turn to. So the city that I'm in right now is Windsor, Ontario, Canada, which is right on the border with Detroit. And so I go to school and work in Detroit, and I come back home and I live in Windsor, which is not very uncommon. But subhanallah, the contrast between the two has become very clear this Ramadan, because in Detroit, everything is open for the most part. The masajid are open. People are going out for iftar and for suhoor. And you have, for those of you who aren't familiar with like Dearborn, Michigan, Dearborn is essentially the Arab food capital of America. And so you have all of these Ramadan food trucks that are out for all the way up till suhoor hours. And meanwhile, in Canada, we had Taraweeh for the first couple nights, but that has now been shut down. That there's a lockdown. There's lockdown, I think maybe 4 or 5 days into Ramadan. And so no more Taraweeh. Technically, the masajid are open with like a 10-person limit, so just like staff. So alhamdulillah, the contrast, like praying Taraweeh, for example, in Michigan, and then coming into Windsor, where you essentially can't even, you can't go to the masjid at all. That's been very interesting. And I will say this, the biggest thing that I noticed is that, subhanAllah, last year, I know a lot of us missed the masjid and we're like, oh, we can't wait till we return. But I think the challenge now is, okay, now that the masajids are opening up, how many people are, and how many people are just like, okay, well, we'd rather stay home because of safety, etc., which is fine. But then how is that translating into our worship? Because I think that there's a lot of exhaustion. I can at least relate to that myself, especially kind of flipping between the two sides and the sort of whiplash that you get between, wait, how seriously should I be taking the concerns here? Granted, I got my first vaccine, alhamdulillah, my first vaccine shot. So I feel a little bit more comfortable, but yeah, it's been an interesting month so far, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, I definitely get that. I'm staying in Sweden right now, but I was in London, which went into full lockdown before I left. And like in Sweden, there are no masks. There's like no social distancing rules. So it just feels really awkward. I'm not sure what the right thing to do is. So yeah, I completely understand that. I think there's definitely a challenge of navigating like the new world of like post-lockdown when it's very much still in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about you, Abdurrahman? How is your Ramadan going so far?
Well, I'm here in New Haven, Connecticut, about just shy of 2 hours outside of New York City, and it's been a good Ramadan. I think it's been a busy time. I teach here at Yale University, and we've just wrapped up classes this week, and students are going into reading week, but a lot of the students on campus are vaccinated. We've been vaccinated, alhamdulillah. And so there has been a little bit more flexibility and leeway. So it's meant that, alhamdulillah, we've had a little bit more flexibility in terms of iftar and getting together and that amazing, kind of gathering of community around Ramadan has been more apparent this year, and we've been able to experience it more this year. But it's just been an incredibly busy time. And I know that's the experience of so many people, isn't it? That in this Zoom world that we have entered, we seem to be busier than ever, although I feel at times less productive than ever as well. And in that busyness, the month has gone by really, really fast. And I think you get to this point where we're in this kind of, in the cusp of the last 10 nights, and we're really feeling like, have we gotten it all? Have we embraced it? So it's so appropriate that we're meeting together tonight in this amazing gathering, because there's going to be a boost. It's at least a boost for me. I can mark my beginning of the 10 nights from being with all of you. But the blessing of Ramadan is there, whether we're busy or we're not, whether we're distracted or we're not. It's just a matter of kind of reaching out and grabbing it and embracing it. So it's it's wonderful to be with all of you.
Amazing. It sounds like you have a really beautiful Ramadan. What about you, Raila?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Sorry, was just trying to unmute myself there. Alhamdulillah, Ramadan's been good. Like everyone says, it's just now we're still kind of being in lockdown. It's just getting used to a much kind of calmer, quieter life. I mean, normally, alhamdulillah, we're very busy on site running these events. So it's kind of a little bit more relaxed, being able to do it all. And especially from someone like myself who has to, so I usually manage the volunteer team here at Ramadan Tent Project. So it's normally a lot more hectic trying to get people together and make sure everyone knows what they're doing. So actually moving to online has kind of made Ramadan a little bit simpler almost. And like, it's good to kind of refocus and kind of see a lot more of family, because that sometimes gets neglected with having to be on site. So yeah, it's been good, though I am missing being on site, and it's great to see so many volunteers rejoining us every year, even online. But it's such a massive difference for those of you who've not been to an event that we do in London or anywhere else that we've done them in the world. They are, mashallah, pretty amazing. So inshallah, next year when we're hopefully all pandemic free to some extent and we go back to a normal life, we can get back to organizing these events and seeing more people face to face, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah, I look forward to that. So I'm just going to get on to today's topic. So today we're going to talk about social justice and community. Both of those themes are quite evident in both of my speakers' work. So one of our guest speakers, Abdurrahman Malik, is an award-winning journalist, director, educator, podcast host of This Is Being Human podcast, and organizer. He's appointed associate research scholar and Islamic studies lecturer at Yale Divinity School. He's also the director of Muslim Leadership Lab, an innovative student leadership program being incubated at Dwight Hall Center of Social Justice at Yale. His work spans 4 continents, and he works to champion social justice and is committed to building a Muslim cultural capital. And our second speaker, Tariq Tamr, is the founder and executive director of ThinkBite, an online publication for college students and young professionals encouraging personal, spiritual, and community development. He's also the podcast producer of the Yaqeen Institute podcast. So just talk us through your work a little bit more, and also if you can discuss what you think about social justice and community, since both of you kind of work around that and also have built yourself communities.
Why don't you go ahead, Tariq? I want to hear about this incredible student work that you're doing in this platform, and inshallah, I can bring up the rear.
There's the only reason why I'll say yes is because I don't want to do the back and forth with you and put you on the spot. That's all. But I have no business speaking about these things in front of you, mashallah. So yeah, alhamdulillah. So I guess I'll speak first, I guess, in general, just given that, subhanAllah, just the kind of, I have a lot of thoughts right now about, what community looks like and how that's sort of changed over the past, year or so, as well as its relationship with social justice. And I guess really the first thing that comes to my mind is specifically just a slight level of disappointment, I think, when we almost speak about social justice as being separate from Islam. And I say this to say that, there's so often nowadays when we use these types of terms, they have every word that we use has a cultural context, right? So when you use the word social justice, there are certain, cultural implications when you use that term and things that people think of, and suddenly everybody will latch on to, whatever they identify with. And based on what they identify with, they will choose, I guess, what their position is on this issue. So if we identify as Muslims, we might first immediately think, hey, Islam, social justice, well, I associate social justice with A, B, and C, therefore I'm opposed to this thing, or I'm cautious about this thing, or whatever. But I think it's important for us to, step back away from, the biases that we bring to these definitions and just strip it down to its core, right? Which is when we talk about social justice, at the end of the day, social justice and community are directly, interconnected. Why? Because social justice, we're talking about what is the playing field that we're creating for human beings around us in order to live and thrive in this world. And ultimately, as believers, if we are saying that our goal in this dunya is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is to prepare for the afterlife, then that means that we have some degree of existence here that is meant to be, that we have to try to optimize to get us to that point in the akhirah, which means there is a need for us to work on some degree in shaping and forming, kind of a healthy social ecosystem so that we can get to that point later. And you think about it just on a very basic level, right? When you consider somebody who is dealing with immense poverty, sometimes for some Muslims in the West who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, the privilege or the blessing of wealth or access to education or, whatever it is, freedom, safety, whatever it is, that whatever these privileges are, I think we forget when we look at poverty, right, whether it's local or whether it's international, we look at it as, but especially I think when we look at it international, when we look at these sort of fundraising campaigns or whatnot, we'll look at, oh, mashallah, like these people, they have nothing and they still love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they went through poverty, they went through war, they went through difficulties, but they still love Allah and they still believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is good to see that and see a reminder that can bring you close to Allah, yes. However, what we sometimes don't see, because these are not going to be highlighted in our fundraising campaigns, and it's not going to be highlighted in some of our experiences, is the immense number of people who, through the difficulties that they go through, turn away from God, and that the difficulties become too much and too burdensome. That's not attractive to highlight, right? But saying this as somebody who, so my parents are Syrian, and it's very interesting when I see all of these like, oh, look at these inspirational stories from people in Syria. Alhamdulillah, it's good to take some sort of benefit from this. I'm not negating that. But knowing, my family there, and knowing what people that they know have gone through in these past few years of, the conflicts there, there's a lot of people who have lost faith. You see this in Palestine. You see this in other. You see this with the Rohingya. You see this with in so many different areas in the world. There are people who go through crises of faith and through difficulties, and there's a relationship between that and going through difficulties in this material world, quote unquote. So when you have the material world stripped away from you or taken away from you, whatever, it's not so easy to just say, okay, difficulty, therefore I'm going to abandon the dunya, and now I'm attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a point of, it takes the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as and facilitated through other means, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy to be able to go through that difficulty and immediately connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reality is the process is not that clean, and it's very difficult. So when we think of social justice, what are we trying to do? We're trying to identify the many different factors that contribute to making people's life in this dunya difficult. And those difficulties, they have a direct correlation with their ability to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their ability to worship. If somebody is so busy so concerned about being able to pay their bills, right? Or managing an abusive situation at home, whatever these circumstances are, an immense amount of debt, all of these things, they have a direct correlation with your ability to say, you know what, I've decided to take a few hours and just worship Allah. I've decided to go take this Islamic class. I've decided to go there's a correlation there. You can't strip these two things away. And so as much as sometimes we want to reduce these conversations and say things like, you know what, here are all my issues with social justice discourse and social justice narratives and blah, 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 all of those, you have to get to a point of saying, well, what's your alternative? Because there are, and granted, while there might be some people who are working in these spaces who might not have the same goals of, we're trying to prepare for an akhirah, we're trying to prepare for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while that might be the case, it doesn't negate the fact that there is so much work that we have to do. And if we care about having a sense of community, which we all care about as individuals, right? We all care about having a sense of community for our own selves. What we have to realize is that if we're not an active part of improving that whole community space for everybody around us, eventually that's going to come and hit you at home. And so whether you want to be selfish about it or you want to be selfless about it, we have a responsibility to look at what we could be doing to kind of be addressing social injustices. And, I'm speaking very generally right now, but really for me, most of my work from that space, I'm involved with a lot of youth work on the ground in our masajid, in our Islamic institutions here, both in Canada and Michigan. And the biggest thing that you realize, man, is so many people who are coming into these institutions, these masajid. I have a general rule, which is if a conversation for me starts with directly like cynicism about who Muslims are, and like Muslims are, oh, our generation is this and our generation is that, and I get very frustrated by that, because from everything that I have seen, it does not take more than a few minutes of conversation with the average person who has come to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or has come to an Islamic gathering, or even just who has decided to talk about faith in some way, to see that there's a lot of believers, the vast majority of believers out there, who really love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and really want Allah. They really want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are so many things that have gotten in the way of them being able to find that, whether it's their fault or whether it's not. That's not the job here. But when people are coming into our institutions and our spaces and they say, I want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a necessary step to be taken, which is, okay, what are the things that you are going through and how could we help alleviate this? How could we work on an individual level? How could we work on a systemic level? And what you see really quickly is that you have to be working on an institution level, on systemic levels. You have to be reaching out to people across the board. It's not a competition of who can do the most or which organization could do the most. There's a necessity for us to be reaching out to others and collaborating and building. And that's just one of the reasons why I love gatherings like this, because at the very least, it reminds us that, hey, we're all in this together and we're all working. We might be working in a different corner and we might be working on a different angle. But at the end of the day, the goal of everything that we're trying to do with young Muslims and with the community as a whole is really just recognize what are the barriers and how can we work to address them. And so this is a little bit was a little bit broad, but that's kind of just sharing a little bit of, I guess, my mentality on these things.
Jazakallah khair, Tariq. That was powerful and necessary. And you said in this kind of, you really gave us, I think, in a pithy, concentrated, and direct way, really the kind of orientation that we need right now. And I think, and I think just to add and really to build on what you're saying, I really think about the time that we're in right now at this very moment as we enter these last 10 days of Ramadan. And what is the theme of these last 10 days? You know, the Prophet has told us the first third, the first part of it was mercy, the second part of it was forgiveness, was the turning to God, and the last part of it is liberation and freedom from the fire. But I think about now, look at the world as Tariq asked us to, as it is right now. The crisis, the continuing crisis around the pandemic, what's happening in places like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and in South America. If folks were reading the New York Times this week, you'd know that places like Peru and Bolivia and Honduras and El Salvador, the situation is mirrored by what we're seeing in happening in India and South Asia and elsewhere. And as we come to terms with that, we're also coming to terms with, as Tariq reminded us, the ongoing systems of oppression that we witness around us. If the pandemic has shown anything, hasn't it shown the division between the haves and the have-nots? Hasn't it shown those who have access to healthcare and those who don't have access to healthcare? Hasn't it shown us the elite who can put their monies away and who can hide behind tax shelters, and those who continue to pay and to work despite the risk to themselves and their families? Hasn't it shown us that those who have computers for all their kids here in New Haven, Tariq, and everyone else? I'll tell you, the schools went into lockdown and the children couldn't attend the online classes because of, obviously, they didn't have enough computers at home in order to attend these classes. We think that bandwidth and the internet is a human right, and yet it's not a human right. And on top of that, in this last 14 months, we've seen the scourge of white supremacy, of anti-Black racism. We've seen police brutality. We've seen the abuses of the carceral state. If these are not fires, I don't know what is. If these are not fires, I don't know what is. And when Tariq says that there are people coming to the masajid, broken-hearted, trying to find healing, turning to community, and the community isn't there to embrace them, isn't there to receive them, is there to categorize them, throw them into silos, throw them into buckets of this identity or that identity, but doesn't welcome them, then I think we are facing multiple crises. And it reminds me, I thought and you probably know this reflection from Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, but I was writing this week for one of our journals here at the Yale Divinity School, and I had come across this and the work of another incredible scholar, Maryam Kashani, and I just want to share this line with you. 2 weeks before his assassination, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz said to a gathering, I think it was in Tuskegee, Alabama, he said, "I believe in religion, but a religion that includes political, economic, and social action designed to eliminate injustice and racism and make a paradise here on earth while we're waiting for the other paradise." You know, liberation from the eternal fire doesn't mean we aren't fighting for liberation here. Liberation from the eternal fire means that we're more dedicated to the liberation from the fires here, because there are those fires that are going to erode faith. There are those fires that are going to break human beings. And the challenge isn't to the ones who are being challenged only, it's to those who are looking on and doing nothing. And so, in a way, as we approach these last 10 nights, I'm thinking a lot about, this is a time of muraqabah, it's a time of muhasabah, it's a time of reflection and fikr, that we're thinking about, what am I doing to be the firefighter? As my beloved mentor and friend, Dr. Fuad Nahdi, Allah yarham, used to say, he says, how are you firefighting? How are you being that source of healing for others? How are you engaging with people and societies and communities and giving the whole of yourself through mercy, compassion, and empathy, so that you can give calm and salam to people. And you know, the Sheikh Fode Drame, in this beautiful book that came out this month called Ramadan and the Quran, talks beautifully about the verses in Surah Ibrahim, where Ibrahim alayhi salam, because of his belief in the radical oneness of God, challenges the existing system. We have to remember, Ibrahim alayhi salam is challenging the existing system. He's breaking the idols. And the powers that be say, we're not only going to punish you, we're going to throw you into the fire, so you understand what the real fire is. And what does Allah do? Makes it a place of safety, coolness, and salam, peace. It's a remarkable thing. And you know, to all of our friends, as we're watching this and we're coming together from all around the world in this beautiful gathering, and I just want to, you know, give props to the Ramadan Tent Project. With the 15 years I lived in London, you know, the years that the project was active and alive, coming to see all of you and being in your company and sitting in the beautiful places where these gatherings were organized was a highlight for Farina, my wife, and I, because there were places of such generous community. There were places of such welcome. There were places where anyone would walk in and find meal and friendship and love. And you know, I think you have all embodied in this project the thing that we all need to embody every day of our lives: the compassion, mercy, and welcome that is offered. And so my call to myself, first of all, before anyone else, is how am I being a means for mercy, compassion, empathy, and justice to be manifest? What am I being, and how am I being that person who is throwing water onto the fires that are striking us? And how am I going to prepare myself, right? And the work that Tariq is doing with Yaqeen and engaging with students, and that all of you are doing, engaging with people, isn't it all about challenging ourselves as well? What about the fire of the ego soul, as Sheikh Fode Drame says? What about the fire of greed and avarice and arrogance and intolerance? What about the fire of judgment and hatred? What about those fires? We can say they're in the hearts of the white supremacists, and we can say they're in the hearts of the Islamophobes and the anti-Semites and the others who wish ill will. But aren't they also in us? Aren't we also hardwired to go down that wretched road when the circumstances around us are difficult? Aren't those sometimes the comfortable and convenient places that we go, pointing fingers of blame, throwing people under the bus, blaming others, when in fact Ramadan teaches us about agency? It's between us and God, the intimate act of fasting. God's given us the agency to hold back. God's given us the agency to challenge ourselves. God's given us the agency to see the fires around us, inshallah, and to act on it. And God's given us the agency to realize that it is through combating the fires of oppression and injustice, that by combating those, we make the conditions by which God's mercy becomes manifest. We become the asbab, as the theologians tell us, right? That we become the asbab, by the means by which Ar-Rahman makes his mercy manifest, by which Ar-Rahim makes his mercy manifest, where the just makes his justice manifest. And who benefits? All of humanity benefits. All of creation benefits. So I just want to say, Tariq, Jazakallah khair, for opening that up so beautifully, and for calling our hearts to a generosity, and an embrace, and an openness. Let's create the big Ramadan tent all year round, right? The tent that welcomes everyone, believer or non-believer, Muslim or not Muslim. Our God is not the God of Muslims. It's the God of all creation, the source of all creation. That's what Tawheed is. It's radical monotheism. It's monotheism without any limits. It's an understanding of the divinity that is open, that is connected, rather, to each and every one of us. That's the reality of the divinity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so let's embrace that, because everyone can access it. This is not a personal club. This wisdom isn't like the wisdom I keep in my back pocket. I don't share with anyone. If we want to create the beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and so many others spoke about and worked for and sacrificed for, then inshallah, let's begin in these last 10 nights and know that as Tariq told us, the work of social justice is not like a rarefied form of work that a few people are involved in. Each and every one of us need to be a means by which that inshallah is manifested. That's my dua for myself, for my beloved family and community, and for this family and community all over the world, that inshallah that we will renew our covenant with God to be the merciful ones who are shown mercy by the merciful one, inshallah.
So Jazakallah khair. I think both of your reflections are incredibly beautiful. I think that Abdurrahman George drew a parallel to the civil rights movement and kind of what Tariq said. And I was kind of going to point that out too. Haj Malik Shabazz, I remember that when you read his book, you realize that he kind of had this very like exclusive idea of Islam, and then he went on Hajj and realized that Islam is in fact inclusive, and racism should not exist in Islam, and kind of changed his message after that and kind of came out quite transformed after Hajj. So to that, I remember that Tariq earlier on stated that when we talk about social justice as Muslims, that we often have a very polarized definition of the word. Would you say that there's a better word for it, or how do you introduce social justice into Islamic spaces to kind of introduce it to everybody without polarizing anybody?
So I won't put myself in the place of academics who have studied this far more deeply. I will say this though, from my conversations with people, who are in these kind of academic spaces, discussing things like terminology and defining things and whatnot, there's a common thread that I've noticed, and it's similar to our use of a term like Islamophobia, or even some other terms. We can sit and debate, terms and their implications and their meanings and what's a better word, etc. Forever. We're never going to get everybody on the same page there. To me, if somebody is stuck on the point of a word, you're missing the underlying issue here. And if we're going to say, well, what is the better way? At the end of the day, however we present it, we're presenting everything exactly as Saad Abdurrahman, Jazakallah khair, mentioned. Or we're putting this from the position of monotheism, from the position of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not talking about social justice for the sake of improving everybody's material reality within a capitalistic framework. No, we're talking about, hey, we're trying to reach Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never promised that everybody would have complete equality in the dunya, in their opportunities and in their kind of material outcomes. That was never promised. We have equality in our connection to Allah, in our ability to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of us can do that. But that's it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will test some of us. I mean, even when we want to think about it, even from the position of like, when we talk about, for example, let's say the context of somebody who might be born with a chronic illness or a disability, and I say this not from the perspective of, maybe an ableist perspective of saying, hey, like that is a bad thing. But most people who are born with a chronic illness, for example, or a disability, they would prefer not to, right? This is clearly a test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them. It's not something that eases your life to be put in a position where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put you in a position where you have something that's difficult to deal with, right? And so that's not a bad thing to say, for us to recognize that, for example, somebody who might not have, for example, the ability to see with their eyes the same way that everybody else can. That is a challenge, right? Are we to say, for example, that there is some dunya where we could remove all of these types of tests that are given to people? There's no way, right? So even if we were to address every single material inequality, Every single thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could still write, whether it's in somebody's genetics or in an accident or something, that there will be some sort of imbalance, we might say, or inequality. Excuse like my imperfection with like my terminology, right? But these things are difficult still to deal with. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, you will be tested in this dunya. And we see this in the Quran constantly, right? You will be tested with loss and poverty and death. These are all things that will be tested with. And so when we have that framework first, starting from the position of recognizing that, and then recognizing that despite that, Rasulullah ﷺ still taught us that even if Yawm al-Qiyamah, if the day of judgment were to arise, then you still plant the seed in your hand. What does that tell you? That our job here is an effort. It's an effort, right? And to me, whether it's fixating on terminology, whether it's fixating on the other things, or the issues of sort of kind of the peripheral, the arguments in the periphery, right? If we're going to sit and fixate on all of those things, to me, that's not effort in planting the seed. We need to make effort in planting the seed. So if you want to discuss those terms, sure, but that can't be the thing that you're doing, right? If your whole issue is let's just critique what everybody is doing wrong, critique is good when it is constructive and leading to some alternative changes, leading to something positive. And unfortunately, just the way that human beings are wired psychologically, have you ever been in a position where you wanted to help somebody and you thought about it in your mind for a second, like, man, I really want to help that person. And then for whatever reason, you don't, maybe you weren't able to, whatever, you still got a little bit of a boost, whether it was, something physiologically, whether it was something with your ego, you get a little bit of a boost sometimes when you think genuinely, like, I wish I could go help that person, and man, I'm going to go up to them and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And like your mind races a little bit ahead. And like, you're in the mindset of, I've now done this good thing. Sometimes thinking about the positive that your actions are leading to can actually delay you from actually doing things. Right. And so sometimes when we're in this position of just constant critique and constant criticisms, we imagine that my words will lead to A, B, and C change in the world. I am preventing this harm, or I am leading to this whatever. But you haven't actually done that. Your ego has kind of gone on this journey, and you've given yourself a little bit of a boost, whether there was that rush of dopamine or that rush of whatever, of feeling that like I did it, I got that feeling of accomplishment, but you didn't actually do it. And so I say this to say that we should genuinely hold ourselves to a higher standard if we are saying that what we are presenting is for the sake of Allah. If we're saying it's for the sake of Allah, not just for the sake of a material thing, not for the sake of our own egos, if what we're doing is for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then what is the nature of the sacrifice that we're putting forward in this pursuit for justice? What is the nature of the sacrifice that we're giving? Is it something that's just about serving myself and just kind of voicing my own issues and my own frustrations, or is this genuinely for Allah? Because if it's for Allah, there's a level of ihsan, and there's a higher degree of what we offer, where we're not just saying, I don't want to make this too much of a side tangent because time, but subhanAllah, this has been on my mind a lot. It's the reaction of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu and Umar radiallahu anhu to the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Umar radiallahu anhu. So first of all, for context, the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam it's not comparable to any other tragedy in the history of the ummah. It was like the death of every possible loved. It's the most loved person. He was the most loved person to every single person in that entire community, and he was taken away from all of them at the same time. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Imagine this. Umar radiallahu anhu, he walks out, and when he's experiencing this, he's threatening to kill anybody who says that the Prophet ﷺ is dead. That's the degree of his pain, his anger, his frustration, his denial. There's no way, don't say this. He's going to return, he's this, he's that. And then what do you have from Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu gets up and he says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was a man. The Prophet he has now passed away. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is hayyun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is living, he's ever living, and he does not die. So those of you who are worshiping Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's passed away. Those of you who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's still with us. I'm paraphrasing the exact phrasing here, but then he cites a verse from the Quran from, I believe, Surah Al Imran, where I actually have it open. 1 second. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu recites بعد أعوذ من الشيطان الرجيم وما محمد إلا رسول قد خلت من قبله الرسل أفإن مات أو قتل انقلبتم على أعقابكم ومن ينقلب على عقبيه فلن يضر الله شيئا وَسَيَجْزِي اللَّهُ الشَّاكِرِينَ. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is no more than a messenger, and indeed many messengers have passed away before him. And if he dies or is killed, will you then turn back on your heels as disbelievers? And he who turns back on his heels, not the least harm will he do to Allah, and Allah will give reward to those who are grateful. I say this for a very specific reason. The reaction from Umar radiallahu anhu, the reaction from others, it was completely justified. It was completely justified. Nobody could say, hey, he was wrong to do this, and that's not the place, it's not the place. But you still saw from Abu Bakr a reaction that showed why exactly he was going to be the next Khalifa, why he was so close to the Prophet ﷺ, why he was his best friend. That's what you saw. You saw something that it does not bring anybody else down, but it shows the status of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So I think that's my question now when we talk about these issues of social justice. They're really difficult issues. They're very emotionally charged. They're very sensitive. They're very painful. My question is, how much are we striving to have the reactions of Abu Bakr when every other reaction is justified? It's difficult, but that's where we turn to the examples of people like Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz and Malcolm X rahmatullah alayh. And I took too much time, but yeah, jazakumullah khair.
I thought it also reminds me of, this question, right? Of do we get stuck in the weeds of these things? And as you said, do we get stuck in terminologies, and do we get stuck in our own positionings? And it brings me back to, it makes me think about the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in that sermon, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam addressed many things, but there's three things that come to my mind that he addressed. He addressed, one, the issue of race and privilege. The white is not better than the black is not better than the white, the Arab is not better than the non-Arab, and the non-Arab is not better than the Arab. Why would the Prophet say that? Hold that thought for a second. And he said, be concerned when it comes to the issues around women. Why would the Prophet say, be concerned? And then the Prophet goes into detail about economic justice and the restitution that needs to happen, that he wants to make sure happens in his absence. Why would he raise the issue of economic justice? Why would he raise those issues if the Rasul's community was the perfect community, in inverted commas? Why would he raise that and say, take this message to those who haven't heard it? And subhanAllah, we've been taking that message generation to generation until that message has come to us. The Rasul was telling us something important. The Rasul knew that in every generation we would face the issue of privilege, power, race, that some would consider themselves better than others because that's the devil's deal. That's the devil's deal from the Quran. That's the arrogance that the devil had, and that's the way the devil wants to lead us, because racism and white supremacy is the most devilish of the injustices and oppressions. The Prophet ﷺ was reminding us about gender and equality. Why? Because the Rasul knew that we as men in particular, we fail. He knew that we will create systems which will oppress. And why did the Prophet address the issue of economic justice when we think that the prophetic community should have perfected that justice? Because in each generation there will become those pernicious elements, what we call it late stage capitalism now, or something else back then, that those things will revisit us. What does that mean? It speaks to exactly what Tariq is speaking about. The goal, my friends, isn't the amelioration of these things. Isn't to solve the problem. It is in our time, with our blood, with our sweat, with our tears, and with our intention to mitigate the harm, to try and do harm reduction, right? Isn't that the believer that is praised? The one who is of benefit to others and does not harm others? Isn't this the prophetic advice that the Rasul's family and righteous companions have continued to give us, and the righteous women and men of this ummah have continued to give us? And that's where I come to. And Tariq, it's so important raising the example of Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Umar. And I also remember that today begins also the marking of the anniversary of the Shahada of Sayyidina Ali, Imam Ali. That today around the Muslim world, we are also remembering that in the holiest of months, in Ramadan, Imam Ali, Sayyidina Ali, Khalifa, Karamallahu wajha, may Allah ennoble his face, was also murdered in internecine Muslim conflict. And so when we take the heaviness, right, of the story that Tariq told us, and we take the heaviness of the prophetic sermon, and we take the heaviness of the example of Sayyidina Ali, whose emblematic quality we know was justice, then what it says to us is that when people argue about these things, I said, go back to the tradition, go back to the words of the prophet. Issues around race and gender and economic inequality are ones that are going to plague the human condition. And therefore, it is our duty, our responsibility to approach those, to meet the challenge of them now. And yes, sometimes those things are going to be difficult. What are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure that people are out of harm's way. That we want to reduce violence and reduce oppression and give us the space, right? The space to live the beloved community and the space to express mercy, compassion, and empathy. And Huda and our friends at RTP, we're coming up to iftar time here in New Haven. I think it hits us first because we're right on the Atlantic Ocean. We're on Long Island Sound before it gets to Tariq in Windsor. So in a moment, Huda, I'm going to have to take my leave of you, with your permission, everyone else. And what an honor!
We were
and
about to
pleasure.
put the ban on.
Well, it's
So
such an honor and pleasure to be with all of you. And Tariq, we have to exchange emails. We must get in touch. We'd love to collaborate and build together, inshallah.
Absolutely. I actually I just added you I think on Facebook and Twitter.
MashaAllah. Let's talk this coming week, and may Allah continue to bless your work and your efforts and your amplification of student voices and the work that you're doing with Yaqeen. May it bear incredible fruit, and may it be the source of inspiration for a whole generation of world changers and mercy warriors, inshallah.
But Barakallah feek and Jazakallah khair. Honestly, Saad Abdurrahman, it's been an amazing conversation. I've just loved like the energy and the wisdom that you've brought to this conversation. It's been incredible. And I hope, inshallah, that we can all just continue to follow in the footsteps of leaders like yourself who have made this not just, kind of a part-time hobby, but really a full kind of life commitment. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us all to continue that work and build and to serve for His sake.
I mean, Jazakallah khair, Sidi, and Jazakallah khair to our friends at RTP. Thank you for everything that you do, and may Allah continue to bless this space. And I can't wait to come back to London and be in the tent physically next Ramadan, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. We really appreciate your insights. You said a lot of things. We've got a lot to talk about and discuss and think about. But before, we'll play the azan in New York for all our listeners in New York. Jazakallah khair.
اللهم إني لك صمت وبك آمنت وعلى رزقك أفطرت ذهب الظمأ وابتلت العروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
So Jazakallah khair for Abdurrahman Malik and his amazing insight, and Jazakallah khair for everybody who's listening from New York. So back to our earlier conversation, we discussed internal bias in not only holding other people accountable, but also holding ourselves accountable during Ramadan. How would you suggest that we hold ourselves accountable and our communities accountable, even when it's hard?
Accountability. It's a tough conversation. It's actually a very, very tough conversation, just because it touches on so many issues. And I think as sort of a catch-all answer, I would just say you can't have a catch-all, because different issues just need to be handled differently. And on a community level, there's a general rule of thumb I have, which is you need to have genuine consultation with people, right? Like you need to have decisions need to be made by people who are who understand whatever the topic is, who have some solid representation from different backgrounds, etc. And let's say, for example, an issue like any kind of community-wide issue, you need to have a group that's actually invested in these issues that are a part of the consultation for whatever the accountability is. Now, that's just because when I'm thinking of social justice, right, and I'm thinking of community accountability, right now you're talking about issues like spiritual abuse, right? You're talking about things like the abuse of funds. You're talking about silence on important topics that require people to speak out. You're talking about a lack of representation for people, and you're talking about racism. You're talking about so many of these issues that are all involved on a community level. I think we need young Muslims to continue to get involved. You need to have institutions that actually have the interest in bringing in young Muslims, and then you have to have Muslims who are educated on these topics, who are part of whatever the decision-making process is. I think a lot of times right now, our communities, we have clubs, as Ustad Abdurrahman was mentioning, right? In our masajid, unfortunately, sometimes you have management or boards or whoever that are, it's a club of people who set up this masjid because they wanted a kind of safe space for themselves and their culture and whatever that community is around that culture. The principles that are forming a lot of our institutions are, they tend to be more about how can this group of people, kind of have a good time. Unfortunately, sometimes there is a mission behind it, but for the average institution, it's really just, hey, we need a place to pray and a place to do basic acts of worship, and whoever we like is going to be kind of coming with us, and we're just moving around there. I genuinely think that we have a problem with understanding what the valid areas of disagreement are and valid areas of differences of opinion. You'll find that there's a lot of minor opinions and disagreements that lead to big splits in communities and divisions that last for decades. So I genuinely think that there is a need for us in our institutions to recognize the need to have diversity, and I say that not with like the tokenizing aspect, right? Because we have a lot of token diversity nowadays, and some people who are happy with that, and some people who are giving people token diversity. That's not what we mean, right? Like if you need diversity in gender, you need diversity in age, you need diversity in even ideological background. So long as we agree on basic foundations of what Islamic values are. The problem is for a lot of us, we take issues that are secondary and tertiary, and we treat those like they are foundational issues. Like we cannot disagree on those things, and that leads to a sort of groupthink that ends up alienating people and pushing people away and making people feel turned off from Islam as a whole, because to them Islam is now this caricature of what a religious person is shaped by these institutions and these places. So in general, I think for our community's sake, we need to have a genuine interest in bringing all people to the table and having them have a share discussion in this, and because once you do that, it's easier to hold people accountable, right? As opposed to, friends are not, unfortunately, sometimes are not good at holding themselves accountable, right? They'll find excuses and they'll, say we're assuming good, et cetera, et cetera. And you end up, what you end up prioritizing is the cohesion of the group as opposed to moving towards a better practice of our Islamic values and principles. And that has to be the foundation of what we build our institutions on. And once you have that, what you're talking about then is there's two streams then, right? Once you establish what these key values and foundational principles are, now you're talking about the long-term plan for accountability, right? Which involves education, it involves having proper systems of consultation, shura, etc. And then you have the short term, right? Which is actually sticking to something, holding your ground, keeping your feet there, keeping your feet firm on those things, and knowing what the red lines are. And right now, I think there's a lot of reasons, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's other factors. There's a lot of reasons why people are soft on accountability, and we think it's for the good of the community. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing now across every industry and every field and every community is that if our community doesn't hold itself accountable, accountability will still take place, but it might not be done with Islamic guidelines shaping the future, right? The other day I saw somebody who was saying something along the lines of it's really difficult to find essentially like a public figure who does not have kind of certain public violations or egregiouses, or things that they've done wrong, and that makes it difficult to recommend their material or whatever to new Muslims, etc. Number one, I would say that alhamdulillah, we do have good people, a lot of good people, alhamdulillah. The vast majority of our leaders and teachers, etc., alhamdulillah, are good. They might not be the biggest, most popular faces, right? But our communities are alhamdulillah, have a lot of khair in them. But number two, it is true to a certain degree that there's a lot of calls for accountability on issues where it feels like there's not a clear level of transparency and what are we doing, etc. But there's a need, I think, for us to engage on the ground with our communities as opposed to just in the sphere of what's being publicly discussed. So that's kind of accountability from the realm of, I guess, social justice, etc. Were you thinking about it from another angle as well?
I was actually thinking about it exactly in that way. But yeah, I definitely think there is a role of inclusivity in our community, like seeking out expertise and kind of holding ourselves accountable in the community properly. Iman has a question in regards to what we were discussing.
Yeah.
Mashallah, like I really enjoyed listening to you and Abdurrahman speak about the whole theme today. We talked a lot about accountability in our communities and, creating safe spaces for everybody to be able to, practice, the right way. I'm just curious because I guess I've lived in, like, you would classify, more Eastern society, like back home, like in the Middle East and, Far East. And I've also lived here in the West. And I've noticed that there's quite a different mentality when it comes towards holding people accountable. So I was just curious, do you think this, being able to hold someone accountable to their mistakes or, make a change in behavior towards something is more of a Western way of, I don't know, correcting behavior versus like back home? I'm not gonna pinpoint where back home because the Middle East and all places like that. You mentioned like for the greater good of the community, you're soft on accountability. But the thing that I'm having a hard time like comprehending is how come back home, when someone does something wrong or, you might not necessarily agree with something, everybody just, keeps mum and they're like, yeah, just let them carry on, whatever, he's on so and so. That's really good for the community. But here in the West, we have the channel and the tools to like hold someone accountable. And I'm sure you're aware with the whole court of public opinion, how you can bring people down and accountable for a certain thing that, I don't know if you would classify them as like, that's the end of their career or like cancel them or whatever. I guess what my question is like, do you notice that difference, or is it just something, I guess, might be an immigrant mentality as well? I don't know. There's like line of thinking that could come to it. Just to hear your opinions on it.
Yeah. So in terms of, I guess the difference between East and West, for example, I don't know. I can't speak on that definitively. I can say that even the West, quote unquote, didn't look like this a few years ago, right? What we're seeing right now is, with the democratization of knowledge and access to the internet and all of these things and new methods of distributing information and social media, all of these things have led to essentially, people who previously did not have voices having more of a voice now. That's happening in a lot of places. Now, granted, you do have in places like in certain other countries, you don't have the same level of freedom of expression and whatnot, and you see how that shapes the conversations that take place. But I think the key thing, the key difference maybe between the two is there's, at least in terms of how we engage with them Islamically, right? There's a way that Islamic principles are used to justify culture. And we see that, for example, there's one statement that I'm not sure who it's attributed to. It's not a hadith, to my knowledge, but it's a statement that is said in some religious spaces, and it has some truth to it, which is something along the lines of "Amitul batil bisukut alayh," which is let like the evil die by not discussing it. So there's certain types of evils, there's certain types of wrongs that the idea is, listen, if we don't amplify it more, it will die out on its own. Sometimes that is used, obviously, in the wrong way, where something that needs to be addressed is not mentioned. You'll have things like honor, right? It's saying something is aib or something is, it's inappropriate, etc., where people will be encouraged not to speak up and not to do this. These are like there's like the religion is used to explain something that exists maybe culturally, but it doesn't necessarily. I don't know how to compare that with the West, because the involvement of Islamic principles with Western culture is much more recent, as opposed to something where you see what I mean. So I don't know how to compare the two. I will say this though: once us as Muslims are outside of that culture and we're in a different culture, we have an ability to engage with Islamic principles and values in a way that is sometimes more stripped away from those cultural biases, right? Where when we're looking at our Islam and we're here in the West and we're saying Islam tells us to stand up for A, B, and C, why should I give precedence to this sort of cultural practice over this Islamic value? You know what I mean? And so I don't know if I would separated as East and West, but I would say just as Muslims in the West, we might have maybe an easier time engaging with the core, because we don't maybe have the same degree. We have our own biases for sure, but maybe in regards to these topics, maybe we don't have the same biases that before we're used to silence, etc. And Allah knows best.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way to look at it, because I mean, I'm sure like all of us have had our fair share of, dealing with our faith in these, and like in the West in general, and like sometimes maybe it is something to do with age as well. The older you get, the more unapologetic you get about your deen, and you're like, no, why should I kind of conform to what this society thinks is okay, but then back home you kind of do the same thing as well. So it's I guess it's like two sides of the same coin, really. But yeah, very interesting take. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're always trying to kind of negotiate how our identity fits into our culture and it fits into our faith, and where how to draw these lines. And I think maybe one thing that is I'm grateful for, at least in kind of the modern kind of conversations around accountability, is that I mean, when you look at the way that things were even just a few years ago, accountability now, and like being able to hold people to account now, at least to my knowledge, at least from what I'm seeing in kind of community spaces, it's much more accepted. Like it's become, now granted, we're still very far from where we need to be. But just like speaking anecdotally, I've been in situations where somebody would say, hey, like this person did this and this person did that, like what are we going to do? Where in previous years these types of things would have been considered normal, and you'll hear like sort of quote unquote the old guard saying things like, yeah, like this has always been the case, it's not a big deal. But I think there is a little bit of a shift happening. I will say this though, the whole kind of term of like canceling and cancel culture or whatever, I have my bold hot take, which is cancel culture doesn't exist. Now somebody's going to ask me to explain that, and well, what does that mean? And we have to define the terms, and we have to have that whole conversation. But the simple way that I can say it is, people who have power now are being held to more account than they were before. And that's because you have people who didn't have power now have a little bit more, because they can put social pressure, and at the end of the day, the question is this, right? As the community is changing, positively or negatively, right? Things change in a community and in their mindset and in their values. As things change, you have to ask yourself, if you're in a position of responsibility, do you want to be relevant to these people or not? Because you can't really isolate, I think, the reasons why society is changing and values are changing. There's a lot of factors that are involved. Cynically, we might just say, oh, this is just the nafs, and this is just our desires let loose. But it's much more than that, right? And it's funny to me when somebody might blame a certain maybe method of thinking, or they'll say, oh, social media is ruining everybody, or it's like you can't isolate the reasons like that, right? Any basic conversation around anything would show you that you can't do that, but we do that kind of casually in our speech anyway. I say this to say that when people have an issue with the way that the culture is shifting or the culture is changing, your question is this: what are our foundational values? What are the things that we care about most in our deen? How are these conflicting with these values? And if there isn't actually a conflict, then you just have to ask yourself, are these the people that you're trying to serve or not? And I think one thing that people are going to have to come to terms with is that some leaders or some institutions or some communities, they don't care to be representative of everybody. So we need to create more spaces. That's it. The onus has to be on us. One thing that I've persisted on for a few years now, whenever I'd have an experience with somebody, a friend or whoever, who would tell me something like, hey, I was trying to get this done with a board or with this institution or with this whatever, and like it didn't work and they didn't want it, whatever. Especially when it comes to the context of masajid, my kind of immediate impulse is just to say, that's a test of your sincerity to some degree. Obviously, you don't stay there and take on immense amounts of abuse and all of these things. But to some degree, if you want to be in these institutions and you want to change them, you have to be patient towards not getting your way. You have to be patient towards understanding the quote unquote game, right? Understanding how to talk to people, how to reach these people, how to get their thinking to shift a little bit, and to speak from within our deen. That's all ultimately the hesitance comes from so many people of when it comes to matters like accountability is, what is this leading to? Right? That's what their thought process tends to be. Like, what if we accept this? What is it going to lead to? And what is the extension of this? So we're worried about change because we don't know what the next steps will be and what the harms could potentially be. And so there's a level of anxiety around that. And so I think for us, if we're trying to say, hey, how do we hold our communities accountable? We start from the foundations of our deen. And we make sure that whatever the direction is, that it's consistent with those values. And you're not going to really be able to do that without speaking from within our tradition and to teachers who can help speak from within that tradition. And the number of people who are entering these spaces and are increasing in their knowledge and their ability to serve in this area are increasing, but we need more. We need more people who are doing more than just repeating conventional social justice discourse, and people who are actually able to put that through an Islamic lens and an Islamic framework, because it's not like our communities are only going to go in one direction, right? We can't just use the standard discourse and pretend, okay, that's just going to work, because our community has a lot to kind of engage with, and at the end of the day, they would rather preserve what we have now than go into the unknown, for better or for worse,
Jazakallah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really good take on the whole topic, really. Yeah.
It's a big topic, honestly. Like, for me, when you talk about things like accountability and whatnot, I'm just like, we can talk about all these things and we'll all agree, but then at the end of the day, you sit down and it's like, okay, well, how are we going to do this? And that's where the disagreements come in, right?
Exactly.
It's like, what are the actual steps? Like, is this too far? Is that not far enough? That's where you need mentorship, and you need consultation, and you need a level of like mercy and rahmah in this process. Like, and that's where, like, to kind of step on that point of like cancel culture, it doesn't, to me, that it's mostly a meaningless term, right? But to some degree, internally at least, we do cancel people. Like, internally, we do cancel people where we feel like, oh, this person did something that is so egregious that they're done. Now, granted, sometimes that might be warranted, right? But in other situations, yeah, I think we have to look at people with some degree of compassion. And this is general, right? I'm not saying that we don't necessarily extend this in every single situation, whatever, but having some degree of compassion, some degree of mercy, where we could recognize that we as a community, these are growing pains. And if we want to be a part of a constructive change, we need to be willing to go through those changes and be patient with them. Inshallah.
Yeah, otherwise I could just keep on discussing this topic, but yeah, that's great. I think Chris just joined us as well. Huda, do you want to take over?
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. That was really insightful. I definitely think that as a child of East African and Middle Eastern immigrants, I definitely think I can look at religion and view these kinds of ideas with kind of a different perspective from maybe like my family. And I do definitely think that there is a lot of interesting things I do want to touch on in a minute, but I'm going to introduce our third speaker, Chris Bulvelt. So he's a firm believer in reviving the goodness of humanity. This can be seen in his work, as he's the founder and the CEO of LaunchGood, the world's largest faith-inspired crowdfunding platform. And his platform has raised over 15 million across 77 countries for thousands of campaigns. He's also the founder of Patreon City, a crowdfunding platform that aims to improve communities. And he's had a diverse professional career, working as an engineer, teacher, founder of an Arabic nonprofit, and the producer of an award-winning Sundance film. So the discussion today, and the theme that we're discussing today, is social justice and community. We've had two speakers so far discussing their thoughts on social justice and community. Chris, would you like to add your insight into it as somebody who works in a platform that has a lot to do with community and social justice?
Hey, Salam alaikum. Can you hear me okay? So I feel bad. I thought I'm on maybe at 9 o'clock, like in 40 minutes, but then I was saying check the link to make sure it's working okay. I'm actually just about to head out to my in-laws to go grab iftar, like pray and eat iftar. So is it okay if I hop back on, or did you need me now?
Oh, no, that's okay. Don't worry.
I feel bad.
No, don't worry. I think maybe that might have just been a miscommunication from our part, but thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I mean, I can Yeah, it's probably better I just go now because it's going to be kind of hectic with 2 kids trying to get them in a car and everything.
Yeah,
But I'll hop on, hopefully in a little bit and say salam to all you guys.
Jazakallah khair. I think we'll be off in about 7 minutes, so you can just hop on whenever you can manage.
Oh, you're going to be off in 7 minutes?
Yeah, I think it might have been a slight miscommunication because we were kind of wrong
it's
about
all
some
good.
of the
Well,
times.
let's talk for 2 minutes then. What questions or things do you want to hear in 2 minutes?
Okay, so what are your takes on community and social justice, kind of from your professional experience? Just give us a few insights.
Oh, it's going to be, I'll just say a kind of a personal story or experience. I became Muslim when I was 16. A big part of that was having read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and going through this awakening, as we all do as teenagers, of like, oh, this world is not so isn't so nice, and there's a lot of problems in it, and it's not, our parents have done a poor job, whatever. You get this very kind of righteous anger as a teenager sometimes. And for me, it was really waking up and understanding that, racism didn't end with the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and I Have a Dream speech. It was like still thriving in America. And that was really upsetting for me. And then I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and he said something in there that America needs Islam because Islam can change people's hearts, and racism is a problem of the hearts. You can change all the laws you want, but if people's hearts don't change, you'll never get rid of racism. And he believed that Islam was a religion that can do it because it did it to him. It did it to people he saw. He went to Hajj. The darkest Africans he's ever seen, sitting with blue-eyed, blonde-haired, Caucasian Muslims for all intents and purposes. And he realized, like, this religion has that potential. And that really attracted me to Islam and a big part of my journey. And I remember my first Ramadan, we were sitting in the mosque and like in a little circle. And like, subhanAllah, I was struck because I was like, wait a second, like, I'm white. The guy next to me is Pakistani. The guy next to him is Arab. The guy next to him is African. The guy next to him is East African. The guy next, and like, then there's African American, and it's like, and then there's an Indonesian. And subhanAllah, is like literally there was a bunch of people, and not one person was the same ethnicity. And I was, especially at that time, I was 17. I was like, this is amazing. This is exactly what Brother Malcolm was talking about. And of course, that was a highlight of my early Islam, and then you realize, as you are Muslim for a longer time, that it's not so perfect like that as a community, and we have our own problems and racism and such. But that memory's always struck me. I do believe that as a community, we have incredible potential. We have this amazing diversity, and for the most part, I think Muslims really love that diversity. We really enjoy eating other people's foods and learning about their cultures and hanging out. Like, it's so we've got ways to go in the community, but there is that potential. But also understanding that connecting back to social justice, we're all one humanity, and really embracing that, and then standing up for when we don't live up to that ideal is really important as well.
Definitely. I think Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz was actually a point of discussion amongst a lot of our guests, and also accountability was a huge point that we discussed a lot. Jazakallah khair. I don't want to hold you up too much. Thank you for your insights. Jazakallah khair.
Again, I feel so embarrassed for getting this all wrong. I look all shaggy and stuff, but alhamdulillah, I'm a big fan of Ramadan 10 Project. I'm a big fan of everything you guys do, and whatever we can do to support you, please let me know.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you. We appreciate your time.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, but one point that you made earlier, Dara, was that we can use social media to kind of build a more inclusive space, hold people accountable, to use it for social justice and community. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh boy, the use of social media. Social media. I'm very conflicted when it comes to social media, because I think social media is a good tool, but it's it's not designed to bring about constructive ends. And it has to be viewed, I think, to me, as more secondary to other methods of communication. When I say social media, I'm thinking of the big open social media platforms, right? I think the future of constructive conversations is in smaller, more kind of concentrated groups, even something like this, right? Where you could have the space for people to both express themselves honestly and to be corrected honestly, and for there to be a level of positive assumption and compassion given, as well as just a basic understanding of what a person's background is. The reason why I say this is because I think a lot of social media, a lot of it, unfortunately, is becoming, it's shifting more into the direction of not just being polarized, but being very performative. And the reason for that is, at least one of the reasons, everything feels like the stakes are so high, right? Like every mistake could be viewed as, this is the mistake that will lead to X person doing whatever thing. And it's this like very fallacious way of thinking, but it makes us treat people as representatives of ideologies as opposed to human beings. We view them as, we view their words as something to be dissected and critiqued and analyzed, etc., as opposed to just being a human being who is, in one chapter of their, many chapters of their life. I think, in smaller groups, you're able to extend a little bit more compassion, a little bit more understanding, and the conversation just become much more constructive. And I think if we continue using social media as just, this is the place for all conversations, we're just going to have more destructive conversations and more polarization and more alienation and more of this kind of splits between people. And I don't think social media is the way for that. Like the way that I think of social media is a good way to do outreach, right? To bring people into something, but it's to bring them into something more meaningful. So there's a very limited number of, I guess, ideas or messages that you could say are suitable for all audiences in all contexts, right? It's definitely not everything. Like if we can already decide there that some things are not appropriate for social media, right? So how do we define what is appropriate for social media, right? One easy conversation, or one easy point, I guess, for that is the whole the Black Lives Matter blackout posts that happened last year, right? A lot of these people thought that they were posting something in solidarity of the murder of George Floyd, right? Putting up the black squares on Instagram and whatnot. Then you had a lot of people in response to this, whether it was activists or and whatnot, who were saying, hey, you're actually flooding people's feeds and not letting them actually get important information. And you're flooding the hashtags that people are using to spread important information. So it's a show of solidarity. Like we see where your heart is, but what is it actually doing in regards to the conversation that's taking place, right? So I say this just as like one like case study, but obviously it's much more than that. Very, very small example. We recently had I'll kind of remove this. There was an incident where somebody was outed for some abuse that they did, right? Now this issue was, this individual was like outed publicly already, and like they were already handled, and it was handled years ago, right? But people recently found out about it, and so they wanted to resurface the topic and rediscuss it, etc. It's like, yeah, but all the accountability measures in terms of removing this person, they've already taken place, right? So what you're actually, the people who you're affecting here are really just like re-traumatizing the family, like the kids and whoever that were involved. Why is it that we need to put out some sort of statement or whatever to just like re-traumatize people and to re-hurt people if the measures were already taking place? But some people say, well, the measures weren't taking place because they didn't take place in front of everybody or publicly in front of the whole world. But is that how it has to be taken place? So there's a lot of conversations that I think have to happen within communities on the ground to recognize. And that's where, by the way, like the side step to that is, this is why we need to be attached to communities, because it's within our community spaces that accountability can take place. So when there are people who are not attached to communities, right, and they don't have people that they're accountable to, those are immediately like red flags that this is a person that there should be caution around this person, because if you can't hold somebody accountable, what role should they have in the public space? It's not a safe one, at least in my experience.
I think that's really
Sorry,
interesting.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think
No,
that's
sorry.
really.
I think I was being called. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think it's almost azan time, like you said.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what you said was really interesting and insightful. I definitely think that we do forget that other people that we're having discourse with online are humans, and we kind of forget that, and we hold people to much higher stakes on the internet. So, final thing, do you have any final thoughts? A few words in like less than a minute.
Final words. Final words is, I mean, honestly, it's just we just ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us and to send people to advise us. And I think all of us should be really worried if we don't have people within our spaces who don't advise us. Like we like if we don't have people who advise us, this isn't like an optional thing, right? You don't surround yourself with people who are going to advise you and correct you because you are trying to just aspire to something higher. No, this is like a necessary part of living. If everybody around you just reinforces your ideas and reinforces your beliefs, if you don't have people around you who can challenge you and help you grow and improve, you're going to regress. It's as simple as that you will stagnate and you will regress. I think that means putting ourselves in spaces where there are people who have more knowledge than us, whether it's in Islam, whether it's in social issues, whether it's in current events, whatever, but having people who know more than you and looking for spaces that people have more than you so that you can just get exposure to something beyond just your normal experiences. And I say that because I think if every single one of us surrounded ourselves with people like that, not only would it increase us in empathy for people we disagree with, but ideally we'd also learn something that we otherwise wouldn't learn. And we just, during Ramadan, just kind of give it a little bit of at least a spiritual point. During Ramadan, especially with being the distance from our community, just to look back into the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and see how many examples Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us of turning to people of knowledge, turning to people of experience, reflecting, just the examples that he gives us of people who do good and people who do bad. So the more that we isolate ourselves in silos where everything is just seen from our own ego's perspective alone, and we don't get to see things from the perspective of other human beings, you're going to increase the likelihood of not only causing harm to yourself, but causing harm to others. So we just ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to have that humility when we engage with our communities, to allow us to be people who like repent first and say, astaghfirullah, and we ask Allah for mercy and forgiveness, and that we do this for our own selves first before we go out to try to even rectify the affairs of the world.
Jazakallah khair. I'm aware that it's going to be the azan in Detroit, so we're going to play the azan right now. Jazakallah khair for your insight.
Which is Aki.
اللهم إني لك صمت وبك آمنت وعلى رزقك أفطرت ذهب الظمأ وابتلت العروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته إنك لا تخلف الميعاد.
So Jazakallah khair for everybody. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Tariq Tamar, Abdurrahman Malik and Chris Bulvold for the engaging speech. We've covered a lot of topics and it's left us with a lot to think about. I just wanted to say thank you again for Islam Channel, our media partner this year, and also the Arts Council UK for making this event possible. You can read more about how we fight world hunger with Islamic relief at iruk.co/RTP. Ramadan is the month of charity and giving, so we wanted to encourage you to support Ramadan Tent Project and help us continue our work. Your support is vital to keeping us going as the world transitions back to normalcy. By helping us continue these events and bringing people from around the world together, but also our open iftars, our Sunnah fast, and other projects. Please check out our link in the chat box, and for more information, we'd really appreciate your donation at launchgood.com/RTP2021. Jazakallah khair. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for everybody who participated and made this event possible. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakum Allah khair for having me, guys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Assalamu alaikum.